Hello and welcome once again to episode 78 of Code Completion. We are a group of iOS developers and educators hoping to share what we love most about development, Apple technology, and completing your code. My name is Dimitri and I'll be your host once again for this episode, and I'm joined today by my fellow completionists, Spencer.
Hey there.
And Fernando.
Hello, hello.
So, since we have Fernando back with us this week, I had a question for him. I heard on the grapevine that you've come around to SwiftUI?
Well, yes and no. Thank you for that question, Dimitri. So, I discussed a little bit on Twitter. A friend of mine was mentioning how it's kind of difficult to keep up with everything Swift related, right? Even though we get like the yearly releases, and you also get like WWDC, which isn't strictly speaking Swift. Swift has been evolving like constantly, and if you follow what's the magic name for the pull requests? Is there a magic name for the Swift pull requests?
Proposals?
Yeah, the
Swift
proposals.
evolution?
Thank you. If you follow the proposals, there's actually a ton of proposals. Even if only a few of them get merged. So the interesting part of this is that I've at least been thinking a lot about the language itself and what I like and don't like about Swift. And I came to the realization that even though, if anyone's familiar with my stance, if anyone's have heard me speak about SwiftUI, you know that I'm like, at best, I'm dubious about it. And at worst, I'm like, it's got no future. But I will say that I agree 100% with the vision of it, right? Apple is expanding constantly, and their platforms have been growing. And so the holy grail would be building an app on SwiftUI, on purely SwiftUI, no need for SwiftUI or any UI hosting view controller, and deploying that app to multiple operating systems, right? And the vision of it seems to be, I would say, debatably within grasp, right? I know both of you have used SwiftUI much more than I have, but it seems that given a few more years, maybe between 3 to 8 years, it would be possible to actually get a code base into different platforms using SwiftUI. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, perfect. So having said that, I may disagree with the implementation of it. That's beyond my rant. The thing is that going back to purely Swift, I don't see that vision there on purely Swift, the language itself. I see that Swift has been expanding its capabilities, and a lot of the things that have been brought to the table have been valuable as a language. I don't see how they're valuable as an app developer. And I just wanted to get your opinion on that. I have a few other things getting to CoreData, but first, like, what do you guys think? Is Swift like the de facto language for apps? Like, let me rephrase that before you go. If there were multiple languages out there that were equally valid when it comes to building apps, would Swift be your number one choice?
Yeah, I would say so. Like, a lot of people like to say that, oh, Swift is not a language for app development and it's too esoteric, it's too academic. Like, everything just gets in the way. I am becoming less and less of that mind the more and more that I get comfortable with its more advanced features. I really do think that just because it's different does not make it bad for app development. In like specific scenarios, it's a lot better for many types of things. It's just not as straightforward as the thing that everyone is potentially used to for decades, right? Not saying that it's easier, and all programming languages are hard. Just look at the amount of people that were able to program in Objective-C. Hardly anyone got motivated enough to be able to do that, despite it being one of the most popular platforms around the world, right? That's the whole reason we have a different language. So Objective-C is not easier than Swift in that regard. So I would go ahead and say that yes, Swift has some advanced features, but it's not so advanced that it prevents people from making the most of it.
I agree, and but I'll add one thing. I really like that you touched Objective C because again, if you've ever heard me speak about SwiftUI or Objective C, you already know how I feel. Um, the objectively, no pun intended, I think Objective C had way less gotchas, way less regionalisms, idiomatic code than Swift, and I think that's actually
Pointers.
a very complicated. What?
See,
Well, I
like there's a whole gotcha there that we
Ye-
can't just ignore.
Uh-huh.
Like I used Objective C knowing nothing about C for the longest time,
uh-huh.
which meant that I was just locked out of a bunch of features. Like, oh, I need an array of CG Rex. I don't know how to do that. Oh well. Moving on. It doesn't mean that that makes Objective C better though. If that makes any
No,
sense.
no. I'm not even saying better. All I'm saying is that I think there is a lot of layers to Swift, and I've heard that being like a positive, right? Like, oh, this is as simple as can be, and if you want to go deeper, you can go deeper. But the more I use the language and the more I teach it to like beginners, 100% beginners, the harder it is to explain or to feel out um, how many of the rules you should know and when you should know them. Whereas with Objective C, which I also taught to beginners, it feels much more easy to pick up if you're willing. Because the thing about Objective C, you're totally right. A lot of people didn't pick it up, even though the iPhone was like the premier platform like 10 years ago. But it was more about the disconnect and the grammatical aspect of it, right?
Yeah, I would go ahead and say that.
So coming from my perspective of like having learned Swift first and not, I mean, I learned Objective-C afterwards, and I really kind of got into learning Objective-C, you know, a couple years after I had kind of been learning Swift already. I get what you mean, that Swift, I think, is a lot deeper. You can go deeper, but at the same time, it feels like the barrier to entry is way higher with Objective-C. There's a lot more like you have to worry about pointers. You know, I mean, if you want to get into really learning about, I don't know, like, I mean, yeah, I don't touch any C related things in Objective-C when I'm doing it even now. It's not anything that, you know, I just don't have much experience in. Whereas I think, kind of going back to your original question, yeah, I think I would use Swift above any other language. Like, I don't know if they were like, yeah, we're adding Kotlin support. At this point, why would I learn something else? It doesn't, or whatever the new hotness is, right? We're like, we're adding Rust support or whatever it is. I don't know. It doesn't matter. um, I'd stick with Swift because one, that's what I'm comfortable with, but also I think a big part is that there is the community behind it. And like you said, like it is evolving so fast, and there is downsides to it where we talked about the transition from Swift 2 to 3 was huge, and lots of the language changed. I mean, Grand Central Dispatch was, I mean, syntactically very different between Swift 2 and 3. It used the old kind of dispatch underscore Q underscore whatever, and then it switched to dispatch Q, and it, you know, you have to get over those changes in between the releases of the language. But once you do, I think all of the changes that have happened to Swift have been for good. Like I rebelled against Codable for a long time when in like Swift 4 when it came out. I didn't like it. I was like, no, JSON serialization team all the way. But then
Still
I
use
got
that
used
under
to
the
it.
hood.
Yeah, no, I know. But I was just like, oh, I'll serialize it myself. Whatever. It's no big deal. And then, you know, eventually I rebelled and relented and started learning it. I was like, okay, this is actually a good change. So I guess what I'm trying to say is with all of these changes to Swift, although it is evolving quickly, it eventually will probably get to a feature complete state where we're like, okay, we're all very satisfied with Swift the way that it is. Maybe in Swift 20, I don't know. but it'll get there to the point where it doesn't evolve so quickly. Um, and that'll be good. That said, because of that community, I think that's what makes it kind of like an exciting language to keep up on. Like you talked about with the proposals, you can go and add your own proposal or be like, yeah, that's a really cool idea. I would love to have that. Like the, conversion from float to CG float. Like that's why wasn't that in the language until just now? You know what I mean? So, I mean, if there's some random idiosyncrasy with Objective C, you kind of just have to live with it at this point. So,
And I think what you bring up is interesting as well. It reminded me that Swift is like developed in the open. If you need to figure out how Codable works, you can look up how Codable works. And it is not necessarily a bunch of C code. Like some of it is C and C++, but a lot of it is just in Swift. Like you can, if you want to know how to write and type erased type, you just need to find an example in the standard library, and there is some sample code you can just go ahead and use. So much of Objective-C was knowing how to work with the frameworks that Apple gave you, right? It wasn't so much Objective-C, the language. The language had like so little surface, you could do nothing with it. Like you didn't have a superclass to work with. You needed to use the NS object as a superclass to get all of the benefits that it provided. And you can make the case that, those parts of Objective-C were also open source, but they were open source in C. It wasn't necessarily something that you can just go ahead and learn from if you didn't necessarily know C. And I say that realistically. I would imagine so many Objective-C developers really didn't necessarily know how C, the language, really worked. The intricacies of like doing shenanigans with pointers and knowing when it's safe to do one thing versus another thing, you really don't have any clue. Whereas in Swift, you can really stay away from most of C and stay in Swift because it is a much larger language. It is capable of so much more. And as a result, the libraries that we kind of are used to from when we say Objective-C as a thing, those are also part of Swift, but they are all like public. You can go ahead and see exactly what is being compiled when you use something that is from the standard library. So yes, Swift is kind of like this ever-growing thing, but so is Objective-C if you also like include all of the inextual parts that were like putting it together, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. Because I agree. Like Objective-C, the language itself wasn't useful by itself. It was the pairing of Objective-C and UIKit or the foundation libraries that actually like brought it to life. So I agree 100% with that. Let me give you a concrete example though. Like in Objective-C, the grammar, as frustrating, which I never found it frustrating, but as frustrating it can be for other people, is relatively stable, right? Once you understand like the square brackets, the labels for parameters, and having semicolons everywhere, there are no surprises when it comes to the grammar of the language. It's a very consistent grammatically. Whereas in Swift, there's just so many different ways of doing the same thing that sometimes it's complicated. Concrete example, closures. Teaching closures to someone is complicated because you either have to teach like the syntactic sugar that comes around with it, and that that usually depends heavily on who is teaching. So for example, there's a few ways of doing closures. Some people like them this way, some people like them that way, and that certainly complicates things. If you start adding up all of the regionalisms or idiomatic parts of Swift, which have continued to be added to the language, it gets way and way more difficult to actually like teach someone, With Objective-C, it was, this is the syntax, memorize it, do it this way. And in general, if there may be new lines or things like that, but in general, it was readable. With Swift, I don't know that is true. Another example, like async, await, and
pausing
closures.
you before
Yeah.
pausing
Go,
you
go, go.
before
Yeah.
another example.
Yeah.
One website, gosh darn block syntax.
Yep.
Like, I don't know how you can say that closures are more complicated than Objective-C when closures have one consistent syntax that is the same with like any other subroutine in the language. And
It's not the same.
it
Like,
is very similar though.
It is
Like,
very similar. I agree. No. I agree with that. Yeah.
Whereas in Objective-C, when you have to deal with blocks which are not part of Objective-C, they're a C feature.
Agreed.
Like, there are 17 different ways of like, I exaggerate, but there are so many different ways that same paradigm is expressed that it is near impossible. Like, as a seasoned Objective-C developer, I finally memorized block syntax way past when I needed to.
Uh-huh. But
So, like,
But that's not my
closure's
point,
the concept. Closure's the concept. I can get that that's a difficult idea to know about, but that is not intrinsic to Swift.
agreed. No,
So
I agree.
are you talking more about like if you have a method and you say, I don't know, create object with, and you always put with there and then your arguments or whatever, like that kind of thing. So I think the thing with that is Objective-C is 38 years old or something like that. It's so old that these standards have been completely solidified to the point where when you don't write something correctly in Objective-C, it doesn't bridge the name well into Swift if you don't put with there, because that is the standard and that has become the standard. Whereas Swift is so new that we're not at that point, I think, where the grammar or kind of the style around things like that has solidified, whether closures need to be on their own lines or you need to, whatever, however the naming convention goes. If you put with inside of the parentheses of a method or whatever, everyone's kind of doing it differently. I agree with you, but I think it's because as a community, we haven't really solidified that, if that makes sense.
So I think both of you are arguing something that's totally different than what I'm trying to say. So maybe like totally my fault perhaps. Closure is definitely not Swift specific, right? Or Objective-C specific. Both of them behave relatively similarly, can be explained in the same way. And standards are likely to develop over time, right? Agreed, Objective-C has like 3 decades plus of a head start, and the standards are not set in stone, but relatively well defined. And I agree that's going to be like, it's going to come along as we go. Agreed on both counts. What I'm trying to say is that in Objective-C, like if you have a function in Objective-C that accepts a closure, there's one way of defining it. Like the grammatic syntax of it is unique.
I can think of two off the top of my head. One, a type def, which makes it consistent with Objective-C, or two, wacky closure syntax.
What
or
is
wacky block syntax. Wacky block syntax in general. Like, spell out to me off the top of your head, how do you put a block as an argument in Objective-C? There's a caret. Does the caret go before the argument? Does it go after the arguments? It changes. Who knows?
It's the worst. Block syntax sucks.
It doesn't change. It
does change.
No,
it changes if it's in a method. It changes if it's declared as a variable.
No. I agree. No. Definitely agreed. That's why I said.
And it's not consistent with the rest of the language. That's what I'm saying. Like,
doesn't matter.
You have a block.
That's not what I'm saying. Agreed.
Okay.
So let me be even more specific then. If there is a call site for a function that accepts a closure in Objective-C, in general, if I were to use wacky closure syntax, there would be a unique way of doing that. Correct?
No, there are two ways. If you make a type def that describes it, then you use the typical C-based type space variable.
let's say, let's be even more specific. I like that. Let's be even more specific. There is a call site with a function that accepts a closure, and I'm going to have an anonymous closure, not a type def. Can we agree that there's only one way of calling that?
Open caret name, that one?
Yes, correct.
Okay, that is not consistent with ID variable as all the other variables.
Agreed. Definitely not consistent. I'm not arguing that. It is. I remember. I do not cite the magics to me. I was there when they were written. Like, I know exactly what you mean. It is not consistent. I still use like block syntax. Oops, I don't know if I can do that, but I still use
gosh
that.
Gosh darn
block syntax. I still use it all the time when I'm in Objective-C. Agree 100%. But there is only one way of doing it, right?
And let me remind, the Swift syntax is a variable name : the type. For normal variables, for closures, the type is just open parentheses, arrow,
that is
result.
A different thing that we would be discussing. How would you do that in Swift where you have an anonymous closure? How many ways? Let's say I have the gosh darn block syntax here. There's like 2 parameters, for example, and a return value. How many ways can you write that in Swift? Again, a call site, an anonymous closure, and no type def, no setting variables or constants. How many different ways can you write that? There's like...
As defining the function or
7.
calling the function?
Are you talking about
calling
like,
the function.
For the closure?
For the function itself. Off the top of my head, there's like...
So you have trailing closure syntax, or
before
you
trailing
have
closure
inline?
syntax. You have no trailing closure syntax. And every parameter and every, like, the return value explicitly defined. There's no trailing closure syntax, only the parameters defined, no return value if it's implicit. If there is no closure syntax, one single parameter, that's a tuple, and the return value. If there is no closure syntax, there is one parameter, which is a tuple value, and no return, as that is implied. There is shorthand syntax. There is what's that? Shorthand is the $0, right?
Yeah.
Right. There's shorthand syntax. There with a return value, shorthand syntax without a return value, and I haven't even gotten into.
You don't have shorthand syntax with the return.
Okay, so 5. Then we get into trailing closures. We have trailing closures with both parameters and a return value, and so on, right? At least another 5 ways. So that's exactly what I'm saying. All of them are equally valid, right? It's subjective which of them you use. Usually, it's more well-known for you to use like trailing closure syntax. But even within trailing closure syntax, it really depends on what you want to do with the closure, whether you go for shorthand, whether you forego the return value, whether I would not recommend the tuple, but like there's at least 3, maybe 4 different ways that are valid that are dependent on context on how to write a closure.
I'm not sure there's a lot of difficulty there, because what Swift is optimizing for here is making something more readable at the call site, if that makes any sense. So if it's more readable to not spell out a whole bunch of variables and say $0 less than $1 for like a sorting closure, then that makes it more readable. It's instantly easier to reason about when you look at that code compared to whatever the alternative would have been in Objective-C.
If you are familiar with shorthand syntax, I agree with you.
Yes, but as a Swift developer, you would have come across shorthand syntax. Like, I'm not saying you can enumerate all the different permutations, but at the end of the day, what you're really learning is you can have a full-on closure syntax, you can have shorthand syntax, or you can have trailing closures. And those are the 3 main variables. You can, yes, permute them any way you want, but those are the 3 styles that you would have learned, and then you are free to combine them in interesting ways that would best suit the reader of your code.
I agree 100%. It's still more complex, right?
I don't think it's more complex. I think
there is much more to
simpler.
learn. Like,
there?
Yeah, of course. Given
like, is it more than just like an example?
Yes, of course. Like, how could it not
again,
be if we use
assuming
more...
assuming you know what a closure is.
Right.
Okay, so if you know the idea of a closure, the idea of a subroutine, that something is going to need to call this at a later date, if you understand that concept,
Right.
are these extra syntax modes more complex, or do they simplify a lot of things by giving you shortcuts when they make the most sense?
That's like saying, I mean, I see where you're going, but you have to know about the modes before they become useful to you, right?
Yeah, but you have to know what a let and a var is as well before like you can use Swift.
No,
that's what I'm saying. It's like so fundamental to the
I don't think that's a
language.
valid comparison, because like in the Objective-C example, I can show someone how to write a blog, and that's the way they'll find it most of the time. Or at least let's be specific again. That's the way they will find it whenever they use anonymous closure and not a type def. Like always, that's the syntax, always. I can show them 20 different examples of different parameters, different return values, different use cases, different contexts, and the reading is the same.
Yes, but all those
in
examples
Swift,
are more complex, right? Because they're harder to read.
Well, if that's what I'm saying. Like, I don't think it's a given for everyone that they're easier to read if the syntax is different all the time.
Well, I mean, if you really wanted to, you could just, select the closure, hit enter, and it would always complete out to the same syntax, and they could get that consistently.
Agreed, but then we lose Dimitri's point, which is that, like, for example, if I'm comparing to...
Well, what I'm saying is if you only want to stick with one type of closure, technically you could.
Yeah.
Again, I agree, but it's not. But it's not whether you can or not. Like, would either of you have like the full tab press enter closure when you're comparing strings? Like,
no, but
$0 and
doesn't mean
$1?
that you can't. I mean, if that's what you want to do.
No, but that's the point. In Objective-C, you can't. You literally cannot.
Okay. If there are multiple solutions that end up doing the same thing, it's syntactic sugar at that point. It doesn't matter.
Agreed. And that's, I guess that rounds up my point in the sense that this is one data point. Swift has been known for adding more and more syntactic sugar.
Sure.
There's a lot of syntactic sugar peppered throughout all the language. And we see it as a positive, like type inference, like closures and their trailing closure syntax. There's a few others. But the point is that all of these tiny additions to the language require more of an investment when learning. And I've seen it with people who want to learn Swift, especially coming from other languages.
Yeah.
Right?
So I think an example for me is like, you're sorry. I think they're called property attributes in Objective-C when you do at property and then you have the parentheses, right? You don't have to add those, but you can.
Good luck finding a reference of all of them.
You could add nullability, or you could not, or you could say it's weak or strong, right? What's the default? Where do you learn that? It's kind of it feels like the same thing for me, where
no, because the syntax is the same, right? Once you figure it out, the syntax is exactly the same. I can show you 10 examples, and they would all be the same. Whereas,
but it's not the same because you don't have to put the annotations at all. That's one permutation. Another is you could do
that's the wrong one, by the way.
I know. I'm just saying you could, right?
But that's the ultimate irony. Is the simplest thing is always the wrong one. Like, you'd never want to use at property with no qualifiers on it.
And the crappy part is the default of atomic is probably not the right thing either, but that's the default.
Agreed.
So, and then you've got any number of permutations, like 4 different property attributes that you can add and permutations thereof.
But those are more like function parameters, right?
No, they're not.
They from a grammatical standpoint.
Some of them
similar.
Some of them are mutually exclusive. Some of them are not. Like, you can combine some, but not others. You can't say it's nullable and non-null.
I agree.
Right?
I agree.
Getter has an equals in it for some odd reason.
Yep.
Then you need to understand how synthesize works on the other end.
Yeah.
And how that links up with instance variables and underlying memory storage.
Yeah, you've got synthesis of getters
so much
and
complexity.
Setters. You could have it synthesize a getter and setter for you. You could use at synthesize. You could, write them yourself.
At dynamic.
That's a place where it does the same thing. You've got multiple different ways of doing
there
it.
be dragons if you don't really know what the hell is going on there.
I agree. But this is a what if, right? Isn't it?
No, yeah. So
What about
I
it?
would agree.
Yeah, no,
with,
this is
with
totally
your
whataboutism.
point.
I totally did that.
So Fernando, I would totally agree with.
It's easy to learn.
I would totally agree with what you're trying to say. If Swift did not have like a very concise guide that would tell you all about the language in one go, like you have all the syntax in one book, and it's not even a very long book.
Funnily enough, I agree. No, I agree. I think that's a huge plus with Swift. Like with Objective C, there's no such thing. Well,
There used to be the Objective-C programming language, but who knows where that is nowadays.
Well, I was gonna say like that's not like a coding standard. That's an explanation, as thorough and useful as it may be. That's an explanation about each feature of the language, but it doesn't tell you like the best practice is X or Y or Z, right? Apple doesn't have that, does it? For Swift. There is
like
no
when
Apple
to
styling
use
guide.
when to
public.
use a trailing closure versus
Correct.
an inline closure.
Yep.
I would say yes. I don't think there
No.
is anything like that, but I don't think there's one answer either. Like what we were talking about earlier,
Whereas in
where it would
Objective-C
ultimately converge to like one thing. I don't think that's the right answer there. I think that there's benefit to having multiple ways of expressing yourselves. It's like in English where we have many words that mean the same thing, and this is in all languages.
In all languages,
we have
yep.
this kind of phenomenon, and that's useful because as you're describing, like I'm not going to come up with an example off the top of my head, but if you're describing something, you can use different words to describe the same thing without sounding like you're repeating yourself 3 times in a sentence, right? So there is benefit to making things easier to understand by using different ways of describing the same thing. So I can see the analogy there with programming languages as well, where if you have multiple ways of expressing similar ideas, you can choose the one that is most optimal for that particular idea. Yes, you may not need to know all the ways to express yourself, but if you know one way to express yourself, you can start the process. And you can learn by reading other code how to express yourself differently. And if that other code is more readable because it is expressed in a different way, 1, you can learn that different way of doing it, but 2, you can understand what the code is trying to do more than just seeing the code for what it is. It's like the whole reason why we don't code in assembly anymore, right? Yes, there's like one way of going about something at the end of the day, and assembly had so many ways that we said, okay, no more of this. We're making one new language, C, and C has one way of doing subroutines, right? So like we simplify down.
Like I'm sure that was a huge benefit of it, but the reason is that it's just faster to program in high-level languages than in low-level languages. It just is, right? That's the silver bullet from the 70s that increased productivity tenfold for developers.
Yes, but is it faster because you're able to write more code, or is it faster because you're no longer needing to think about difficult inconsistencies with like how you can go about doing something in a way that's not going to crash?
Probably the former, because the latter still affects C, and C is a high-level language.
Yes, but a whole class of issues, like not knowing how to branch out of a simple branching statement, like that is not an issue anymore, right? Yes, C brings it with it new issues.
I'm pretty sure that's still an issue, yeah. On C, at least. If we're talking about high-level languages, then yes. In Swift, no, of course not. But that's like a 3rd, 4th, 5th generation top-level language.
Yeah, so that's what I'm getting at, is Swift, yes, it is more complex. There are more ways to say the same thing, but all of those ways can lead to more correct code that I don't see that being a downside, that there might be a second way of, like, think of it this way. if you know how to program, okay, I'm going off of that premise. Like, you're not learning this as your very first language, because you'll have trouble with any language once you hit any stumbling block if this is your first language. But if you do know how to program and you come across Swift's 5 different closure syntaxes, you're going to be able to read through most of them without really knowing how to do it yourself.
I have empirically and anecdotally, for what it's worth, I have not seen that. I've taught my Intro to Closures class more than a handful of times, and every single time there are almost literally gasps when I show like the 7 or 8 ways of writing a closure in Swift.
Yeah, I agree. And I have been there. I remember closures were one of the hardest things for me personally. And I think when I was teaching, they're hard. They're hard to grasp. I think this whole conversation boils down to the learning
Yes.
part of your journey. As soon as that learning part is over, you're fine. It doesn't matter if there's 1 or if there's 10 different ways to do something. You can either decide for yourself, or at the very least have some consciousness within you to say, this feels like the best solution to, this is the best kind of closure, or whatever, right? Okay. Not sure how to say this well. I know that the learning part is hard, and a lot of people are in that probably right now, but that is a very small part of your entire career, if that makes sense. So I'm not trying to discount it. I'm saying specifically in the closure.
I know what you mean. Yeah.
Once you get over that hump of, oh crap, there's 7 different types of closures, you're fine. And so I think as you progress in that, you're going to see, oh, okay, the language is like this. There's different ways to do this. You'll be probably a little bit more ready for it the next time it comes around. I don't know.
Agreed.
I'm just trying to
I
say,
think you're totally right.
This isn't like a showstopper, like, oh, definitely you should learn some other language. And I know that's not what you're getting at either.
I sort of am, in a sense. Like, there isn't even a question as to whether you should learn Swift if you want to code for any of Apple's platforms. Like, I am never ever going to recommend like go and learn Dart, Flutter, Xamarin, whatever. That's not. It doesn't make sense, right? Even though people do it, and I don't understand. I understand why I would never approve. I have seen, and that's part of the rant. I have seen people literally go, "Oh wow, this is like very complicated," and then moving to something else, right? And I think we agree on generally on what you just said. Learning is like, albeit a very difficult part of your career, it's actually fairly small when it comes to things like this, right? Like Dimitri said, I don't want to read the full syntax every time, especially when I'm comparing like one string to another, or if I can use like key paths. Like, I don't want to do that. Agreed 100%. But Apple has complete control of the language, right? They, like, Chris Ladner left the core team because he with all his weight and reputation, he couldn't push Apple and the core team towards the path he wanted Swift to take, right? That's why he left, that and the toxicity. So my point is, why are we not doing more to make the language easier to understand for everyone than easier to understand for pros? Because we're leaving behind a lot of people that go into JavaScript and go like, hey, this is very simple. And we all know it's not very simple. JavaScript is riddled with these stupid caveats. But they go over there because it's like, boom, 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 I can start coding. Boom, 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 I can start coding. And it's not the case in Swift.
How much of that is needing to learn all of UIKit at the same time that you are learning Swift?
I think that doesn't help. Well, I would say both UIKit and SwiftUI. I've been mentoring SwiftUI people.
Yeah,
lately.
Anything. I don't. What I'm saying is
the
like
language versus frameworks.
To do something silly on a website, like, you really don't need to learn about the DOM and all that. Like you can just go ahead and write in the most naive possible way some HTML, and like you hit the road running there. Similarly, there's a million different frameworks with a million different manifestos, and like, oh, this is great because you just have to do this, this, and this. And then once you go too far from the path, it becomes near impossible to keep up with it. But that very first introduction is very easy. Like it's very handholdy, and you can get in easily. With Apple's platforms, you really need to know a lot to get started doing anything when it comes to UIKit specifically. Like you really need to know how UIKit works if you're going to let it work for you and not start banging your head against storyboards and constraints and all these different things that you're learning simultaneously. It's like, oh great, this API needs a closure. I don't even know what that is. Does that make sense? So it has nothing to do with Swift at that point, that like the API is obtuse enough to need some advanced knowledge of programming itself. Like you could go through JavaScript quite easily and never need to know what a closure is. Or you can start using a framework that only uses closures, and therefore you know what a closure is without even ever being told what a closure is. Does that make sense? Just because that's the one way that you do the thing in that framework that you're learning. Whereas UIKit is all over the place. SwiftUI is so new, and there's so many, like the help that you're going to get is going to lead you down a path that is like fraught. So it like might not be help at all. So yeah, I'm not sure if like this is so conflated that it's kind of a moot argument pointing the finger at Swift than it is like everything as a whole. Does that make sense?
I mean, that kind of just helped me think about like in the web world, the world of the wide web, we have, you know, like the web developers. I don't even remember all of these frameworks. I'm just gonna kind of, you know, throw some off the cuff, and they might not be the right thing, but you'll kind of get what I mean. It's, you know, they're going from like Vue to whatever JS and all of these different frameworks to build React JS or whatever. I don't know. They're switching between these frameworks every like 3 years, it seems like, to just some completely new architecture. And I wonder if that is partially, like you said, Dimitri, because they use it for the foreseeable future, and then they run into this one thing that they're like, oh crap, this doesn't work. Let's paradigm shift and go to a different framework. And then they're kind of giving up all that institutional knowledge where maybe it's easy to get into, but it doesn't stick. Whereas maybe the barrier to entry for Swift is high, but you're also learning those frameworks. But because it's kind of within the ecosystem, you're staying within UIKit and or SwiftUI, and that's what it is. And I don't think we're going to be seeing any new UI framework anytime soon. So I think
this is why I began my my rant with the SwiftUI mention, right? I may disagree with the implementation. I think we're very far from where we should be, and we shouldn't, but the vision is sound. The vision is, let's build something simple that can work in all of our operating systems. And I agree that there is this unique pairing between the language and the frameworks that certainly complicates things and leads to a much steeper ramp that you have to climb to actually start understanding things. And this brings me to the core data part, which is like just another tiny data point, but core data is just a monstrosity. And it really is, to me, the sticking point for all of this, like all of our rant and discussion, that Apple hasn't really done anything to make core data a good Swift citizen. How many years have we spent in Swift already? And core data is still core data. Yes, they've improved, and yes, it's easier now to use in Swift than it was before, but it's still like archaic. It's still clunky. It's still difficult to use. Did you guys read about the the zero team exploits that used predicates and core data. I don't know if it
No.
used core data, but it for sure used predicates. So I'm just like, Apple's number one priority should be let's help developers build apps easier so that you can get going fast. And it seems to me that Swift started out that way and it's been growing more and more complex. SwiftUI started out that way and it's still way too far. UI kit is like Dimitri already said, like storyboards, constraints, nibs, view controllers, hierarchy. Like, where is why are we not like the web? Why are we not closer to the web in the ways that matter? I don't want to code in HTML or whatever, even though I am learning Ruby and Rails. But I just want this to be way more simple. That's the rant.
So I don't think core data is ever going to have the future you hope for it.
I know.
So let me outline why. And I don't think it's just because Apple is like dragging their feet here. The way core data is structured is it's creating an object graph, right? You have relationships between individual objects, not records in a table, which is what a database tends to be. Now, this flies right in the face of what Swift tried to do from day one, is to promote value types instead of reference types. And that is fundamentally not what core data is. So I don't know if there is a better analogy. Like, yes, Apple could polish up core data so that way the types, like there's a proper optional Swift type and things like that. And there's less like auto-generated interfaces in the background that like hinge on Objective-C being there for it to be something. Like, totally, they can revamp that part, but it doesn't help with anyone who's trying to structure their data model in a way that Swift shines, if that makes any sense.
Makes perfect sense.
So I don't see Apple ever really updating core data in a meaningful way without replacing it outright with something new that's incompatible with it at a fundamental level.
And I don't think they need to replace core data. Although it's funny that core data is like hard for beginners and hard for pros. Like, if you want to go to the bleeding edge, like I know some apps have completely foregone core data in favor of like directly manipulating SQLite, because it's like at some point it makes more sense. The point of all of this is, and I think now I found my ground, and this is why I wanted to chat with both of you, is that this is too complicated. Like, it's needlessly complicated. Swift is a little bit needlessly complicated. It's been growing in my mind. SwiftUI is trying, and I hope it succeeds. Core data is really complicated. Like, why do we need all... we should have like the matrix, the product matrix that Steve Jobs introduced a long time ago, like desktop, mobile, pro, and amateur. We should have that for apps. And I think it's sort of like... I think the idea is there with now the introduction of playgrounds on the iPad. I really like that. But it's like we're losing so much to the web, and I hate to see that. I hate when I try to introduce someone to like iOS programming, and it's just so much harder than introducing them to the web. It's frustrating.
I wonder how much of that is intrinsic to the problem space, if that makes any sense. Like, the fact that we are dealing with real like blocks of memory, that we are shuffling data around, that we are computing resources, like none of that is made simpler by the web. In fact, it's a lot of those aspects are a lot harder on the web than it would have been on a native platform. Like, you have direct access to things, you can do amazing things, it's just harder, right? And if you want to do something really simple, like, you can just don't wish for more, right? In a way, like you can go ahead and build a very simple SwiftUI app that has some corner cases that just don't work well, but That's the same for if you want to write a web app, right? You're going to hit a certain point where it's going to be tough and hard, and you get it working in Chrome and it no longer works in Safari, and like you forgot about Firefox this whole time. Like there are major complexities that require being an expert in your field in both. And I don't think that iOS necessarily has a much steeper learning curve to get the basics going. I mean, it's tremendously easy to put something on the screen and play around with it in just a few lines of code. In fact, it's almost always been that way on Apple platforms with like the Cocoa frameworks because they facilitate making apps. That said, if you want to start from the beginning having a totally custom thing, it's an uphill battle because it's just made more complicated by the fact that the frameworks were made to make something that's very standard across all applications, and like it's never going to be easy to make something custom using those frameworks because you have to do it yourself. You have to now step out of the comfort zone of everything is provided for you and invent something brand new, as any developer eventually will do at least once in their careers, right? So, like, yes, it might seem like, oh, it's easy to do stuff on the web. And I think a lot of that is just because there are so many more frameworks, because it is a much larger platform for many more folks to kind of take part in. And we are in a very secluded platform of Apple devices, right? There's much fewer things for us to use, but at the same time, Apple as a platform vendor does an excellent job at providing us with the necessities to do something. Like there's no UI framework for the web. Like if you want to make something, agreed. Someone had to make it. So therefore you use what someone made. And if you want to do it their way, then it's easy. But if you start to diverge from that path, it becomes hell. So then you switch to a different framework that has a different set of priorities. And you have 200 of these different frameworks that all have different sets of like pros and cons. But at the same time, you're not really a web developer. You're a React developer, or you're a Vue developer, or you're an Angular developer. Like you become a professional in that specific space, right?
Yep.
So as you're just starting out, you're not a professional in any of those, and therefore you can do simple things in all of them, right? And same for iOS. Like I remember when I was just starting to learn how to program on the Mac, I would just open up Interface Builder and I was like, I put a thing together just by dragging and dropping little widgets, you know? Like it was so much easier than even web development, just because it was like no brainer to just like drag things on, right click and connect things. And
so then what happened, Dimitri? Why is it not like that today? I agree with you.
You could still do that today if you want to make something that has the plain UI style that the system provides. If you don't want to do that, though, then it's, once again, an uphill battle.
Then is it how we're teaching?
I would think so, yeah. Like, we are immediately going down the path that, like, we want to teach how to make this particular app that looks like this. There's a lot to that all of a sudden. That assumption started off in hard mode, right? We're not even starting off on let's bring you as far as we can without even touching closures, right?
Yeah.
So that way you have a good foundation. And then like, hey, haven't you ever just wanted to pass around a function? Bam, closures. Like at that point, it's a thing that clicks, right? Whereas at this point, like day 2 of learning iOS development, you're going to run into closures somehow. And you're not going to really...
is all closures.
But do you need to know that?
Yes.
Not really.
No.
Yeah, do you need to know that an H stack takes a closure?
Yes, because I'll tell you why. I've seen it with... These have not been my students. These are like someone else is mentoring SwiftUI students. And they've told me that... this is really funny, but this comes to like what you said about closures in Objective-C. Like... it's a very different syntax than the rest of the language. Well, SwiftUI is a very different syntax from the
Yeah.
rest of the language.
Yeah, it's like
And so there is a difficulty there in that if you begin with SwiftUI and then you try to move to pure Swift, there is a huge disconnect that happens there that is hard to explain to some people at least. So what I think what you're saying is totally right. I think there is an issue here with teaching. And I think that thought experiment of let's see how far we can go without touching closures is something that's worthy of exploring. I'm just saying that I don't think the status quo of like it just works with SwiftUI. It becomes black magic to beginners very quickly, very quickly.
I think it's important to have as much black magic as possible. Honestly,
I don't think
it's
so.
black magic
I
to
think
me,
100%
dude.
disagree.
It's
like
SwiftUI is
do you
not
know
a great
what's going
example.
on? No, but like honestly speaking, do you know what's going on the CPU for scheduling everything that's running on your computer? No, we have no
Agreed.
clue, right?
No, agreed.
It's all black magic.
No, because for my use case of being a professional developer, and this is what people are trying to build towards. I don't need to know to go that deep into the stack. Whereas if you were trying to get a job, you would need to explain what a closure is and how those are built in SwiftUI. And the sooner you know, the better, because it's very difficult to understand even at a little bit deeper than a surface level how SwiftUI works. I'll give you a concrete example. Debugging things in SwiftUI, and that one I have seen in one of my mentees, can be very difficult.
Yeah, that's fair.
It can be very difficult. And I'm not saying UIKit is easier or the solution. Like, that is what about is 100%. All I'm saying is that this is really hard.
Yeah.
It's really hard. Debugging in SwiftUI is really hard.
Is it difficult because we can't use print and we can't like fall back on that?
I think it's just difficult. Maybe. I think it's difficult because the syntax is very different than Swift. It is still Swift in a weird
it's using a
sense.
DSL. It's literally a domain specific language. It's not,
Right.
syntactically the same as the rest of the language. So
Yeah. Like
I
if,
think-
if you learn how to put together a UI in SwiftUI, you did not learn Swift. You learned how to
Yeah.
put together a UI in SwiftUI.
Yep.
Same as like HTML. Like you can do that in HTML as much as you could do it in SwiftUI. It's the same thing with a different arrangement around every line of code, right? You're describing the blocks that put together a UI.
I mean, SwiftUI to UIKit is, the same as like Angular versus Vue or something. Like they're
Right.
very much different, right? I mean, on a surface level. Okay, real quick, I wanted to go back to like the teaching thing. I think going back specifically to like separating out the language from the frameworks, I think that would be a huge thing. I know we talked about this at one point at Lambda where students could potentially have a week of Swift without any iOS. Like we're sitting in a playground. There's, we're not importing UIKit. We're not importing Foundation. We're just talking about the language itself. I think in that context, maybe that would be easier if we, like you said, get into closures as soon as possible. But if it's in the context of, we're going to run this sequentially, and then we can talk about how the closure, you write the closure up here, but it gets called down here, it could potentially make things easier. And again, you could extend that to any specific language feature that if we take it out of the context of this multi-threaded application that you have things showing up on the screen and there, you've got all of this stuff going on, but you boil it down to like, let's have this linear code run. Perhaps it could be easier, and perhaps you're already doing that. So I don't know, but I think the concept of closures, you could show them, okay, we're going to write this closure this one way, and then we're going to write the same closure another way with the $sign, and then, go from there.
So that reminds me of something that I noticed with a lot of students. There was no concept, like we started very early, like let's build an app, right?
Yeah.
But as a result of that, there was no concept to understanding what the computer was doing with the code. there was a loose understanding of, oh, the order matters, but it doesn't. Like, you can put methods anywhere, but then the lines of code, like, sometimes matter. But, like, students would not make the connection that every line of code was sequential and it would jump around. And I think that has a huge amount of, like, problematic input into how understanding what the code is doing. It's kind of like learning to speak before you learn how to read, right?
Yeah.
Like, so many students could type code, but they wouldn't even understand what the code they wrote did, if that makes
even
any
at a
sense.
fundamental level, right?
Yeah.
I think, and I get that they're like, we're going to build an app on day one, but I think there are definitely some inherent problems with that.
I know it's like Dimitri said, like, okay, let's build an app. Yeah, hard mode, engage.
Yeah.
And the parallel with that and something like JavaScript and the web is, on the web, you'll write some HTML. There's no implicit order to that. You're describing what a layout engine is going to do with stuff, right? That's what HTML is doing. And then you need some JavaScript. You just put a little script and you write some JavaScript, and that's going to generate some HTML right there. So you're not really writing long form code. You're just like replacing pieces with dynamic elements little by little. And eventually you get to the point where you need a JavaScript file, and now that's a hurdle all of a sudden. Because now you're no longer dealing with inline code that's just adding some dynamism to what you're working with. You're working with, like, full-on programming where you have different methods and you have an execution order and things like that. But
the
that's
progression
not
is steady, right?
I don't think it is.
Really? I don't know. I haven't talked.
I don't think it is. And I think that when it comes to teaching, it's not fun to just look at code from day one.
Agreed.
It's fun to look at apps, and that is a mistake. Like, kind of like what you said before, where when you start, like, you may not need to know closures until you go for that job interview and they're going to ask you what closures are, and then you're stuck, right? That is not the route that a lot of longtime developers came to development. They did not learn over a few month period about a programming language from nothing just to suddenly go pass a gauntlet of interviews, right? That's not how I gained my experience. I don't know about Spencer. You're unique because you learned it via teaching.
Right.
But Fernando, I would assume you're very similar. Like, you learned how to code and then you were a master at it, and like getting a job at that point was just easy.
Yep.
Right? So I wonder if that concept of like, oh, you'll learn how to code and then you'll get a job doing that is the problematic aspect, right? Because we're trying to force a bunch of concepts that you can't learn like instantly unless you know a bunch of domain knowledge, which you can't. Like, you were never taught throughout like all of your schooling how any of this works. Like, you have domain knowledge in math and in history. Like, you were taught over a long period of time how all those things worked and were put together. But programming, oftentimes it's like not a thing in schools. Nowadays, thankfully it is. Maybe the next generation is going to have it a lot easier, because they're going to know from a fundamental level, hey, when you look at code, it's going to go line by line, one at a time, and start doing things, right? Like, how many people that we've taught did not know that fact, compared to how many students that are learning Scratch in high school are learning that fact from day one, right?
Yeah, totally.
Yes, it's the boring way to learn programming. Like, you're not making an app, and you can make an app from day one. Like, it's easy to put together a UI and have something that approximates an app very quickly. But as you start to get to that second half of development where you need to like make it into a product, or actually make it do things in a correct way and not be full of bugs and this, that, and other things, like, that is hard and it's not easy. And we are expecting people to learn it so quickly when it's not possible to learn it so quickly. Like, you need to stumble along while you're learning that. And the way that so many of us stumbled along was putting together something for ourselves and being okay with it being not complete because it couldn't be complete, right? So therefore, we learned slowly how to work around those things.
And the stakes were not as high. Like if you built something and you didn't want to keep building it because it was hard and you didn't want to learn, you just stopped and then you put it away and then you came back to it later. And if you have like a deadline, 9 months, I need to be at work, blah, 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 you don't have that option of like learning organically. It has to be like
That's a lot of pressure.
cram, more concepts,
Yeah.
more difficult. Yeah, you're totally right. I like this. This is interesting. It's given me a lot of things to think about.
I mean, I also remember seeing something recently on Twitter, and it went along the lines of, if you have like a class of students, right, and you're all learning pottery, you can divide the class in two, and half of the class you can tell them you have 1 month to craft the perfect plate. And the other half, you say you have 1 month. Every day of that month, you're to craft a plate and throw it out. And then at the end, who's going to have better results? Is it going to be part of Group A, who spent 1 month working on one thing? Or is it going to be part of Group B, who spent 1 month working on 30 things, and at the end was so much better at making that thing because they've just been doing it over and over and over and over and over again? That they've developed experience doing it. They've learned tricks how to work around gaps in their own knowledge. Like, you don't need to know what a closure is. You just need to know how to use it. You just need to walk the talk, right? Or is it talk the walk? I don't know.
Talk the talk.
You'll just...
And walk the walk.
Walk the walk. Sorry, my bad. None of us know what we're talking about. Ignore everything.
It's like 2 + 2 equals
What?
var.
Exactly.
That's what we're good at. But yeah, like I really think that so much of the black magic doesn't need to be understood. You just need to be able to know when to use it, and eventually you'll understand it. Eventually, like, you'll gain that domain knowledge that explains everything. You'll understand, like, oh, there's actually little electrons going through, and that works. It's not something that's just magic anymore. But you don't need any of that to like get the job done, and you can go tremendously far, like, not faking it till you make it, because you're not really faking it. You are understanding, just not at a level that you understand. Just like speaking English. No one knows except a second language student who studied English as like an adult how hard this language is. Yet so many people can speak it naturally, make tons of mistakes along the way and not even realize, and just continue, right? Like, we've done it countless times in this past hour, I'm sure.
Yeah.
And it's not something that people understand. No one understands how English works. Like, you try to come up with rules like I before E except after C, except in all these words that we're not going to talk about, because none of that has anything to do with the rule, because the rule is made up just as like a quick shorthand
Everything in life
by teachers one of those days. Like, so yeah, going back to programming, I really don't think we need to know exactly what things do and how they work. I really think that it just comes down to getting an intuitive knowledge about like what something is going to do. That is going to be more useful.
And I also think
the vast majority of times.
And I think to piggyback off that, I think it depends on its context, right? Like, does a junior need to know exactly how closures work? Probably not. Does a senior? Probably, right? And so I think it's a lot more, there's a lot more
nuance.
Exactly. No. Okay. Side note, I think you speak English better than I do, and I'm not joking about that. I have very many times thought that, and I've told that to my parents. So,
thank you, Spencer. I appreciate that.
Honestly, it's very true. There's a lot more nuance to it, and Fernando's exactly right. So, definitely depends where you at.
That. Can you say that again?
Fernando's right.
Spencer. You're the best, Spencer.
Dude, man, you're the best.
Cool. I think we all agree. It's we all agree that we should scrap Swift and move to Ruby. Isn't that what?
Is that what we got out of this? I don't think so.
I think so.
No.
Fernando was right. move over to Ruby?
I would rather die.
I would rather die. I think that we got the episode's name.
This week's episode of Code Completion is brought to you by Sticky Widgets. Sticky Widgets is the absolute easiest way to put a sticky note on your home screen and edit it quickly. It's so easy, you never need to open the app itself. Add a sticky widget to your home screen through the iOS home screen editor and tap on it to edit. That's about it. Of course, there's tons of customization options as well: font, color, text size, alignment, all conveniently located in the system's edit widget interface. Add as many sticky widgets as you like, or put them in a smart stack. Sticky widgets are digital sticky notes for your phone. Use them however you like. Sticky Widgets is a free download on the App Store, and additional font and color options are available as a one-time in-app purchase. Thank you so much to Sticky Widgets for sponsoring Code Completion. Check out Sticky Widgets on the iOS App Store today. And as always, I want to personally thank everyone for listening in this week. Please be sure to follow us on Twitter at Code Completion to know when new episodes get released, and feel free to tweet at us if there's ever a topic you'd like for us to dig into. Most importantly, as a small podcast, please be sure to share this with your friends and family who are also interested in any part of the process of app development. It's your support that enables us to continue doing this, and we hope to grow a healthy community around everything we discuss. Once again, I want to give my thanks to Spencer, who is at Spencer C. Curtis, that's SpencerCurtis on Twitter. Fernando, who is at From Junior to Senior, that's FromJRTOSR on Twitter, for joining me this week. My name once again is Dimitri. You can find me at Dimitri Buñol. That's DIMITRI BOUNIOL, and we'll see you all next week.
Bye-bye. So no Ruby.
You are muted,
actually,
Spencer.
After this...
Fight me.
After this podcast, I'm going to start with my Rails course in earnest. Like, seriously.
Did you already start learning Ruby?
Yeah, I finished the basic. Like, there's a place called Pragmatic Studio that has a bundle, which is Ruby, Rails, and Ruby blocks. So closures. Yay! I'm gonna have fun. I finished the basic Ruby. It feels very web, which is really funny. Like, it's the web. I can sense it immediately. And I'm gonna start with Rails today, see how much I can get going. Cause I'm on vacation all of this week, so I'm gonna see how far I can go, and that way, like, one thing I really like and wouldn't be possible in Swift, but in Ruby, if you have a Boolean, you have to finish the variable name when you're consuming it with a question mark.
That would make it an optional.
Exactly, I know we can't, but I really, really like that because it's immediately visible
That it's a
that
Boolean?
you're asking a question, right?
Yeah, but you could just name it something like a question like should whatever or is whatever.
Spencer.
Dude, I'm 1000% on the Swift bandwagon. You will never kick me off.
I'm not trying.
I've invested too much into learning its interesting.
My entire career hinges on this dude. Okay, come on, man. This is how I make a living.
I'm not the guy to push you off the wagon. I've like 13 years
I know.
hanging on by a Swift thread. Well, probably 5 or 6 with Objective-C, and then the rest were from Swift. So I am totally fine with that.
All right.
For the longest time, I've defended being a specialist instead of a polyglot. But now that I'm a polyglot, I can make fun of specialists.
Oh, okay. All right.
Well, I'm not,
all right,
but
all right.
once I am, it'll be easy.
Uh-huh. All right. Be that way. Are you counting like real languages in that, or?
Of course.
Oh, okay.
I can code in Spanish.
What's
I mean, in theory, I could code in Spanish.
what do you have to be? How many languages is it? 6 for a polyglot? 5?
4, right? Well, polyglot is just many.
Yeah, I think there's
So
like a
whatever
specific amount though.
I'm reminded of a joke from a movie or something. If you speak 3 languages, you are
A polyglot?
trilingual. If you speak
Yeah.
Okay.
2 languages, you are.
Bilingual.
Bilingual?
And if you speak 1 language, you are.
American.
There you go.
Yes!
Nice. American. That's pretty fair, dude.
And I didn't need to say it. Perfect.
I like that.
That's good.
So Google says polyglot is like several.
Yeah, in Wikipedia it says 6 or more.
What? No, Wikipedia is obviously
I am part
an
Greek,
unreliable
and
source.
poly is a Greek
Aha!
term,
Let's-
and therefore it just means more than one. So
right.
you're good.
Exactly.
Then I'm a polyglot too.
You're both right.
Right.
Multilingualism.
Yes.
That one's more than 6.
All right. All right. We're splitting hairs now.
Yeah, learning languages is fun in real life.
Yeah, it's
more
super
than
fun.
programming. I used to like want to learn a whole bunch of programming languages, and then it just got tedious, like, to be honest. And I more and more found like success in one and not in the others, and therefore I just stopped learning or doing anything in the others. I mean, the whole reason why I liked native development more than web development was because it was such a headache to deal with, like, multiple browsers and having everything work. Like, if you're working with one browser, great. No wonder so many people just want to force Chrome.
Yeah.
Because if they can make it work on Chrome, then they're good. But then it doesn't necessarily work on Firefox, and it doesn't necessarily work on Safari. Like, we can't even use the website that we're using to record this on Safari.
Yeah.
It just does not work.
No.
So I have Brave installed as my Chromium thing, because
That's a
Chrome
good idea. Yeah.
Chrome is just creepy.
Yeah.
Yep.
And yeah, like, it's definitely a set of trade-offs. You just have to pick for yourself. The more you learn about any one of them, the more you'll learn that it's fraught full of landmines here every which way that you look.
There be dragons everywhere.
Yeah. And
everything.
which scenery do you like more is at the end of the day the answer that you can answer for yourself. I like my scenery because it pays very well. But other sceneries are just as good, even if they pay more or less. It's just what in the end makes you not hate your job.
Yeah.
I mean,
Agreed.
at the end of the day, that's what's going to get you the farthest.
Yeah.
If you can continue doing it.
Yeah, we all like Apple stuff. And look, man, if I were to become a web developer, I would only optimize for Safari just to spite everyone.
I like that.
Yeah. Which would suck because
I had
now
a
they
friend-
don't even have Safari for Windows or anything anymore. It would, like, ecosystem lock
Right.
everyone.
That was such a shame because
dude.
one, the text rendering looks nice on Windows for the first freaking time. That was back in the Windows XP days, right?
Yeah.
Where, like, they still use clear type, whatever they called
Was
it, where
in
they
XP? Was it that?
It was a
that
long
ago?
time ago.
yeah. I don't know. They used whichever thing that it, like, moved the pixels over and it, like, made all text look hideous. Yeah, that one.
Apparently, you can still do it. Install Safari
Oh, really?
on Windows 10 and 11.
Oh, is it just... Oh, I thought it was unsupported. I
mean, I'm pretty sure it's unsupported.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Wait, like,
but
how
you
can you do it? It's
could.
not like they distribute it anymore.
It's unsupported. It's been unsupported for 10 years. The last version was in 2012.
Dude.
But I just found the guide, which is like, this is how you can install Safari on Windows
I'm gonna
10.
try it tonight.
21 March 2022.
Oh.
So,
You mean March
there's a will,
22nd,
there's a way.
2022.
whatever.
Just kidding.
I had a friend, speaking of like polyglots, I have a friend who did an Advent of Code.
Mhm.
Have you guys heard of it?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know exactly what it is.
It's like
It's every
she
day
did
every day of the month you get something new to kind of challenge yourself with.
like an advent
Kinda like an
calendar,
advent calendar.
for code.
Oh, well, she did it on a different language every day.
Come on, I'm not even, like, religious and I knew that.
I'm sorry. I don't speak English well. Sorry.
Then I really don't. You're just like
Um,
throwing us in the dirt here.
No, Advent. I don't know what Advent is. Like,
I don't either.
All I know is it's a thing you can poke chocolates out.
Yeah, there you go.
we
Of-
go back to closures.
I feel
But
safe
yeah,
with
she-
closures.
I remember she told me, turn off stupid webcam. This is annoying. I need to get one of those 4K with autofocus. But a friend, like, she did the 25 Advent days on like 25 languages, and that's like way too intense. And when she did Objective C, I was like, "Yay! How did you like it?" I hated every minute of it.
Too many
You can't
square
learn
brackets.
something in like one. You can't learn to appreciate something in one day. I don't think.
No,
for sure
absolutely.
not.
But still, Objective C is different.
Yeah, it's like an acquired taste.
Yeah, it's like food. You need to give it 3 tries, because the first time you try something that's very heavily flavored, you're probably not going to like it. The second time, your tongue remembers that there's something special about it, but your brain is still like, this is too weird for me, and you're not going to like it. The third time, though, now your brain started to remember what your tongue was telling it, and it's like,
You were right.
I'm down for this really wacky thing that is like so strong and so impossible to like stomach. Yeah, that, like,
That's fair.
honestly, I think all acquired tastes, they're just like stuff that is so packed full of flavor that it's like too much. Like your poor naive tongue cannot like handle it all at once, and so it rejects it. Like, just out of it's like too much for me.
Yeah.
And that's Objective C. It's just too much for people, and they just can't take the square brackets. But you just give it a try, and
It's so pretty.
the square
I like it
brackets
a lot.
they grow on
And
you.
when you get like 4 sets of square brackets, you're like, oh my gosh, man. Like, as a student, I was like, I hate this. I mean, it wasn't until, honestly, I was teaching at Lambda, and I had gone through an entire other teaching job for 2 years that I started to like Objective C. So, I mean, that's just me, but it took me a while.
So when, speaking of like strange foods and trying them, when's the code completion meetup?
Whenever, man.
In 7 years, when COVID ends,
Oh my.
Yeah. We really should do it, though. It'd be sweet.
And Dimi, if we end up doing it in LA, you have to take us to that sushi place. And Spencer just nodded along when you said you have to try it 3 times. So I'll
I've
try
tried
whatever
sushi.
you. No, not sushi. Dimitri's sushi.
Oh, I want to try Dimitri's
stuff.
expensive sushi.
Really?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Good sushi. Like,
I mean, now I'm
I
bound
know
to
it's good
try it,
sushi, right? I mean, better than like flown in fish from into the middle of the United States. So I'm down.
the dirty secret is this is also flown in fish.
No.
It's not like they fish it in LA.
Well, okay, fair.
It comes from Japan.
All right.
It comes from all over the world. So like the ultimate irony is you can have good sushi anywhere. You just need to
Anywhere.
know the people that are willing to ship it to you on one plane ride, and not over multiple hops. Who knows where?
Yeah.
I remember seeing a documentary about a New York sushi chef that was hardcore, and he flew in tuna like from Tokyo every day. Yeah,
That's
I
super
really
cool.
like. I really want to try good sushi. I've had decently good sushi at Austin, and I've had decent sushi at Japan, but I didn't have the skills to get to like really good sushi on either place. So
Yeah, let's do it. I'd love to get some sweet sushi.
It won't be sweet though. Be savory.
Some killer sushi.
but
On that high note.
yeah, I like that.
All right. See ya.
Bye everyone.
Bye guys, take care.